Okay, so good morning everyone. I am Maria Angelica Hidalapan from the Bachelor of Secondary Education major in Science. So before we dive into discussing the cell membrane, let's think about this first. So every cell in our body has its own protective barrier, and this barrier is called the cell membrane. So it is like the gatekeeper of the cell. So it decides what goes in and out and helps the cell to communicate with its surroundings and also keeps everything inside safe. So the question is, how does this gatekeeper work and what makes it so flexible and strong at the same time? So to understand this, we need to look at its structure and the components that make it up. So let's explore this together by starting with a fluid mosaic model, which shows the basic structure and composition of a cell membrane. So this is the fluid mosaic model of cellular membranes. So let's start first discussing the basic structure of a cell membrane. So for its basic structure, we have the phospholipid bilayer, or the main structural component showing how the hydrophilic heads, which face outside or outward, and also the hydrophilic tails face inward. So for more clear picture, this is the phospholipid bilayer. So the circle one is its hydrophilic heads, and its tail is called the hydrophobic tails. So we have to take note that lipid tails of phospholipids are unsaturated. And next, we also have the extracellular fluid, which is found outside. It is shown by the fact that the phospholipids and proteins can move around within the layer, giving the membrane flexibility. Now, let's talk about the basic composition of a cell membrane by using this fluid mosaic model. So first we have the phospholipid bilayer again, which is the main structure of the plasma membrane, and it is made up of phospholipid molecules. So this bilayer creates a flexible barrier that controls what enters and what exits the cell. So next we have the cholesterol, this one. So the cholesterol are embedded within the phospholipid bilayer, and they help maintain the fluidity of the membrane, preventing it from becoming too rigid or too fluid. So next we have the glycoprotein. So the glycoproteins are proteins with carbohydrate chains attached to them. So they are located on the outer surface of the membrane and play a key role on recognizing or in cell recognition and communication. For example, glycoproteins help the immune system recognize the body's own cells versus the foreign cells. Next is the carbohydrates. So the carbohydrates change attached to the proteins or lipids like glycoproteins are involved in cell-to-cell communication. So these carbohydrate chains can help cells identify each other and form tissues, like when cells of the same type are grouped together to form organs. And next we have the receptor protein. So the receptor proteins are embedded in the membrane and fluid and bind rather to specific molecules such as hormones. So once they bind to their target, they trigger a response inside the cells such as the activation of a signaling pathway. So these receptors are essential for the cell to communicate with its environment. Next, we have the transport protein. So transport proteins help move substances across the membrane. So some substances cannot pass directly through the phospholipid bilayer because they are too large or charged. So transport proteins like channel or carrier proteins allow them to enter or exit the cell. So for example, glucose or ions may need these proteins to pass through the membrane. And next we have the recognition protein. So the recognition proteins are also found in the membrane and help the protein or the help cells identify each other. So they act like name tags signaling to the immune system whether a cell is a part of the body or an invader. So they are important for the body's defense and tissue organization. And lastly is the protein filaments. pink one. So the protein filaments inside the cell are part of the cell cytoskeleton. So these filaments help maintain the cell shape and provide structural support, and they also assist with the movement of materials with the cell and help anchor some of the membrane proteins in place. So in conclusion, the plasma membrane is a fluid structure with phospholipids that can move around, making it flexible. So it also called a mosaic because of the variety of molecules such as the proteins, the lipids, and the carbohydrates embedded in or attached to the membrane, so each serving different functions like transport, communication, and structure. And lastly, the cholesterol ensures membrane fluidity. Glycoproteins and recognition proteins help with the cell communication and identification, while receptor proteins and transfer proteins assist in communication and the transport of the substances. So this image shows how complex and dynamic the cell membrane is, allowing it to perform essential functions that keep the cell alive and interacting with its environment. So this is what I'm talking earlier. The transport proteins, they regulate movement of hydrophilic molecules through membrane. The receptor proteins trigger cell activity when molecule from outside the environment binds to protein, and the recognition protein allow the cells to recognize or attach to one another. So glycoproteins are the proteins with attached carbohydrate groups. Now, how are these substances transported across membranes? So the answer is through concentration gradients. So concentration is the number of molecules in a given unit of volume. Likewise, grams, liter, and moles per liter. And the gradient is the difference between two regions of space such that molecules move from one region to the other. So let's talk about now the types of movement across the membranes. So first we have the passive transport. So the passive transport is when substances move from a high concentration to low concentration, like how a ball rolls down the hill. So as you can see, this process doesn't require energy, and again substances move down concentration gradients. So we have diffusion. This is the simplest movement, or this is the simplest type of passive transport. Molecules like oxygen or carbon dioxide move directly across the membrane from a high concentration to a low concentration until both sides are balanced. So the greater the concentration gradient, the faster diffusion occurs, and diffusion will continue until gradient is eliminated, and diffusion cannot move molecules rapidly over long distances. So first we have the simple diffusion. So small molecules pass directly through the phospholipid layer, and the rate depends on the molecule size, the concentration gradient, and the lipid solubility. Next is the facilitated diffusion. So because of some molecules like glucose, amino acids, and ions are too large or charged to pass through the membrane on their own, so they need the help of protein channels or carrier proteins, but they still move from high to low concentration, so no energy is required. And lastly, we have the osmosis. So movement of water from an area of high water to area of low water across semi-permeable membrane. So this diffusion of water across membrane, so what happens is that water moves from an area with more water or less solute to an area with less water or more solute to balance the concentrations. So So the osmosis and living cells. So we have two types. First is the isotonic solution. So outside of the cell has same solute as inside of the cell. So that is isotonic solution. No net water movement. And we have the hypertonic solution. Outside of the cell has higher solute than inside of the cell. So the net water movement out of the cell. And lastly, I'm sorry, we have the hypotonic solution. So inside of the cell has higher solute than outside of the cell. So tonicity is relative to the inside of the cell. So net water movement is inside of the cell. And next we have the active transport. So for active transport, it requires energy, usually from the ATP, because these substances are moving against their concentration gradients from low concentration to high concentration. So picture it just like pushing a ball uphill. I'm sorry. So and lastly is the no, it's not the last one. We have also the endocytosis. So movement of large particle into cells or vesicle formation. So the cell takes place or takes in large particles by engulfing them in its membrane. So there are types of endocytosis. First is the pinocytosis or cell drinking. So these are the uptake. The cell wraps its membrane around large particles like bacteria, bringing them inside. And we have the receptor-mediated endocytes, uptake of specific molecules via coated pits, and phagocytosis. This is the cell eating, uptake of large particles, or the cell wraps the membrane around large particles like bacteria, bringing them inside. So that is phagocytosis. Let me clear. Pinocytosis is when the cell engulfs droplets of fluid, taking in dissolved substances. So this is what happens in pinocytosis. The cell engulfs droplets of fluid, taking them in dissolved substances. And this is in the receptor-mediated endocytosis. And lastly is the phagocytosis. So next we have the exocytosis, the movement of large particles out of the cell, so just like hormones. So this is the reverse of endocytosis. The cell removes large particles or waste. So this is one. So this is the reverse. Again, this is the reverse of endocytosis. The cell removes large particles or waste by packaging them in a vesicle or a small membrane-bound sac that fuses with the cell membrane and releases the contents outside. So, in summary, the passive transport is the diffusion, the facilitated diffusion, and the osmosis. It moves the substances from high to low concentration without using energy. And for active transport, it uses energy to move substances from low to high concentration. And we have the bulk transport. It moves large particles in or out of the cell through processes like endocytosis and exocytosis. So this balance of movement is crucial for keeping the cell environment stable and functioning properly. So in conclusion, the cell membrane is a vital part of every cell, acting as a flexible yet strong barrier that enters or that controls what enters and exits the cell. So through the fluid mosaic model, we see that combination of phospholipids, proteins, carbohydrates, and cholesterol all work together to keep all cell protected, allowing communication and maintain a stable environment. So understanding its structure and components helps us just see how complex and essential the membrane is in keeping the cell and ultimately our bodies functioning properly. So without this organized and dynamic system, cells wouldn't be able to survive or interact with their surroundings. So that's all. Thank you.